Welcome to Stress-Free IEP. You do not need to do it all alone. With your host, Frances Shefter, Principal of Shefter Law. You can get more details and catch prior episodes at www.shefterlaw.com. The Stress-Free IEP video podcast is also posted on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can listen to episodes through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Stress-Free IEP, Frances Shefter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. It is the end of August. I cannot believe summer is over and school is started. I don't know about you guys, but I blinked and summer was over. I don't feel like I went to the pool at all this summer, although I was a few times. But next year, I'm going to try to make it more. Today's special guest is Daniela Feldhausen, who is the founder and an instructor at Kids Up Reading Tutors. And Daniela has her master's degree in special education and completed her Orton Gillingham training at the Institute for Multisensory Education. So Daniela, tell us a little bit about you and how Kids Up Reading Coaches came about.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'll go back a little bit. I was actually a lawyer in DC for about 25 years. And then decided a while back that I was done with the lawyering thing and wanted to do something else with my life. Went back to school, got a master's degree in special ed. I always knew I wanted to teach dyslexic kids. I'm not even sure why exactly. One of my kids was struggling with reading, but it wasn't actually dyslexia. But in any event, just teaching kids to read has always been a passion of mine. So I went back to school, learned how to do it for real. And then I started this tutoring company. At first it was just me, and there were so many families, so many kids needing help. And one day I was walking down the street with a neighbor of mine who is a professor in the linguistics department, and saying, how do I help even more kids? And she's like, why don't you hire some of my PhD students in linguistics? They know how our language works. You can teach them to teach kids to read. And that was a brilliant idea. And so that's exactly what I did. So we are now actually a team of about 20 tutors, including linguistic students, as well as students who are in speech language hearing, so studying to become speech language pathologists, and students in the College of Education who are studying to become future teachers. So we're working with students one-on-one to get them up to grade level. And at the same time, we're training the future educators so that when they go out into the workforce, they will be working with entire, bigger groups or classrooms full of students.
Which is so wonderful because, I've had people on the show before, lots of reading tutors who were reading specialists and reading specialist teachers and had degrees in reading specialists, but none of them were ever taught how to teach kids with dyslexia. Yeah. And it's such a different way of teaching.
It is, although really it shouldn't be. And, I think we're moving in the right direction in this country. If you provide good instruction that is founded on how you teach dyslexic kids to read, that's good for kids who don't have dyslexia also. So you can actually use the same kind of instruction for all kids, whether or not they have dyslexia. It's just that the kids with dyslexia need more of it. That's really the big difference. It's not that there's one kind of instruction for kids who aren't dyslexic and a totally different kind of instruction for kids who are. You can really do the same kind of instruction with all kids and help all of them.
Right. Which is what we say all the time. Like I talked about when I did my master's in special ed, I had been teaching for a couple of years, and I went and I'm like learning all these techniques. I'm like, why don't they teach this to regular ed teachers? This is just good teaching. Like it shouldn't just be special ed, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, the research shows that about a third of all kids learn to read on their own. They might be reading before they even get to kindergarten. They just kind of figure it out. Another third or so of kids will figure it out if you give them some kind of instruction, any kind of instruction. It almost doesn't matter what. Just give them a little push, and they'll be on their way and they'll figure the rest out. But there's a full 40% of the population that needs something more than that. They need good instruction. And it's not that 40% of the population has dyslexia. The kids who have dyslexia are a subset of those 40%. So we work with a lot of kids, only about half of whom have officially been diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia. Some of those might be diagnosed if they were to go to a psychologist and get the diagnosis. But really, all of them need good instruction. And so that's what we provide. We provide them really good instruction.
So why would parents need to hire a private tutor? I mean, I'm sure like a lot of listeners are like, well, if they have an IEP, they're special ed, they should get the supports in school. Why would a private tutor be necessary?
So a couple different reasons. One is that unfortunately, not all general education teachers and not all special education teachers have been trained in this kind of instruction. So that's that's a foundational problem. First, you need to make sure that you've got a special ed, like assuming you're on an IEP or your student is on an IEP, you need to hope that the teacher has actually been trained in how to teach dyslexic students to read. So that's kind of the first hurdle. And then the second hurdle is that even if you have a teacher who's gone through all the training, who knows exactly what to do, there aren't enough hours in a regular school day to teach a student with dyslexia to read. There just aren't. I mean, as part of the IEP, your student might get 60 minutes of reading instruction per week, or maybe if you're lucky, they'll get 90 minutes of instruction per week. But that includes all of the other things that the special ed teacher also needs to do, and all of those other things that need to happen during that time. So that might, depending on the situation, it might include, 5 minutes walking from this classroom to that classroom. It might include a lot of formal progress monitoring and a lot of record keeping. It might include the special ed teacher having to provide the student what's called access to the curriculum. So that if, for example, the classroom is working on a unit about butterflies and the student can't read the passage about butterflies that the other students are reading, then the special ed teacher might read that passage to them about the butterflies. This is all good. This helps the student, but it doesn't help the student learn to read. It doesn't help the student learn to get those words off the page or decode or get the words back on the page or encoding. So it's, even in the best of all possible worlds, I don't see how a special ed teacher is going to teach a student with dyslexia to read. And I've talked to many, many, many special ed teachers, and I always ask the same question. So how many students have you actually taught to read and then graduated out of your special ed program? And they just look at me and they're like, yeah, no, the only kids who graduate out of special ed because they know how to read now is those who've gotten tutoring on the side, which is unfortunate. This is not the way it should be, but that's where we're at this point. I do think that over the years, I think things will get better. I think we're moving in the right direction in this country. The states have all passed dyslexia-related legislation. Kids are now, as all of these things kick in the various states, kids will be required to be tested for dyslexia, for example, in kindergarten and first grade. And the schools will be notifying the parents. And over time, existing teachers all need to be trained in how to teach a dyslexic kid to read. And future teachers, so new hires, will all need to be trained in how to teach kids to read. The exact timelines differ, by state. And, in some states we've got the timelines, but we don't have the funding. So it's all, we're not in that perfect world yet, but we are moving to a world that is much better than it is now. So I think in, let's say, 10 years, 20 years, we'll need a whole lot fewer people like us. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet.
And I would say one of the other problems is that the reading curriculums that the school systems buy that the teachers have to use. So even if they have that knowledge of how to teach a child with dyslexia to read, they have to follow the gen ed teachers in the gen ed classroom, even the special ed teacher on the gen ed curriculum have to follow that curriculum, and there's not that much wiggle room to do the instruction.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I know of principals who still believe in whole language, balanced literacy, 3 cueing system, whatever you want to call it, who have told, a special ed teacher colleague of mine, no, she may not use these other ways of teaching kids to read because he doesn't believe in that. She's required to use the standard, balanced literacy approach to reading. So at this point, the stars still have to align in order for your child to get good instruction in school. And if they do, that's still likely not going to be enough time for them to actually get caught up. They will make progress, right? Like the IEP will set out certain goals, fingers crossed. It'll say your child will learn, let's say, the AI and the AY phonics patterns, or, IE, whatever all the different phonics patterns are. And your child, presumably, hopefully, will learn those phonics patterns. But there are so many, there's so much material that students need to learn in order to be good, good fluent readers, from phonological skills to phonics skills to morphology, and on and on. There's no way to cram that into 90 minutes a week, assuming you even get 90 minutes a week.
And the other thing to balance is that those 90 minutes a week pulled out of a classroom, the child's missing that other instruction. So then what happens? They're trying to catch up with the other things. So they're catching up with reading, but falling behind in other. And it's just that balance constant.
Yeah. And schools will pull kids out at different times of day. So I've seen schools that will pull students out of their English language art, their ELA, which, as a reading instructor, like, no, this is what they need a double dose of. Keep them in English, pull them out of something else. I've seen, kids being pulled out of an elective or not taking Spanish in order to be able to do this. So I've seen different schools approach it in different ways. Probably a very individualized decision as to what would be best for any particular student. But it's tough because, that special ed teacher isn't just working with that particular student, with one particular student. The special ed teacher is likely going to be working with 5 or 10 or I don't know how many students. And it's going to be tough to pull this student out of ELA, but this student we're going to pull out of Spanish, and this student we're going to pull out of something else. That makes scheduling really, really difficult for the schools.
Right. Yeah, and it's hard because I know, for some kids, like, you don't want to pull them out of any of your content, but you don't want to pull them out of their specials either, because then the kid feels like they're being punished. Right. Like, I don't get to do art. I don't, now, unless it's a kid that hates art or hates PE, then that's a little bit different. That, okay, we can miss those. But even still, it's that well-rounded learning everything that the kid's going to miss out on.
Yeah. And then you've got the other model, you've got the push-in model in special ed, where the special ed teacher comes into the classroom rather than pulling the kids out. There's a lot to be said for that model, but I don't know that it works particularly well to teach a kid the foundational reading skills that they need. Because if you're trying to learn phonological skills or phonics skills while there are 25 other kids in the classroom doing something else, that's not going to work. That's going to work better if you're, for example, as a teacher, pushing into, the science classroom where they're talking about butterflies, the example I gave before, and then the special ed teacher can be with that student or that group of students and talk about the butterfly passage in particular. But that's not effective for teaching kids the foundational skills that they need in order to be able to decode and encode, get the words off the page and put them back on the page.
Right. And that's what part of the problem. I know it's been in my experience. I don't know if it's been yours as well, but a lot of times dyslexia doesn't come out until either 3rd grade, or then I see it also coming out in middle school. Because these kids are so bright that they're able to mask it, they're able to hide it and use context clues and use everything else to figure it out that nobody knows they can't read.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. When I first started doing this, I thought, it's going to be relatively easy to teach, to get a kindergartner or 1st grader caught up. It's going to be that much more difficult to get a 4th grader caught up, even more to get a middle schooler or a high schooler caught up. That's actually not how it's worked. So what I've discovered is we have quite a few high school students. So students who weren't diagnosed with dyslexia until they were in 10th grade or 11th grade. And those kids are often much quicker to get caught up than the kids who are diagnosed in 1st grade and in 2nd grade. And I think it's because of what you're describing. These kids have all kinds of other skills. They've got good, working memory. They've got, a quick processing speed. They've got lots of background knowledge. They've got a great vocabulary. They've got so many other supporting skills that helped them mask the problem until they got to high school. But those supporting skills are also going to help them as they're learning to decode and encode, as they're learning those foundational reading skills. So we've actually had a bunch of high schoolers who were quicker to get caught up than the little ones, than the elementary schools, elementary school students that we work with.
Yeah, I had a potential client. We did a strategy session, and it was a middle school child that just got diagnosed with dyslexia. And I said, look, you can 100% hire me. I can get the school to agree that the child has dyslexia. I can get you the perfect IEP. But at this grade level in middle school, they do not have the capacity to teach your child the way your child needs to be taught, the foundation in schools.
Yeah.
Take your money, please, and go hire an outside tutor that's trained in whichever, Wilson, OG, all the others, but trained specifically to help kids with dyslexia. Put your money there, and you're going to do your child so much more better.
Yeah.
That's what your child needs to get, right?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Yeah, schools aren't equipped to do this in middle school or in high school. I'm not even so sure how much they would do in 5th grade, but certainly in elementary school, they are doing it. The problem is, I've oftentimes parents will ask me to coordinate with a special ed teacher at school, and we're happy to do it. Sometimes you really discover the problems, though. Like one time, for example, I was working with a student who was in 4th grade, and his school was using the Wilson Foundations program, which is great. And they were using that in special ed. And so I'm talking to his special ed teacher saying, okay, so what are you working on with him? Let me know so that I can work on the same thing or supporting skills, and we can be helping each other out, and we can have this good flow of communication back and forth. And he said, yes, absolutely. We're working on multisyllabic words with our controlled vowels. And I just looked at him and said, but this student can't read a 1-syllable word with our controlled vowels. Like, this student was at the very early CVC level. They might have been in 4th grade, but they had just missed all of that instruction. Couldn't read a single syllable word with an R controlled vowel. And now in school, the instruction in special ed was multisyllabic words with R controlled vowels. And I was like, but that's not going to work. And the teacher was like, yeah, but this is what we're required to do. So this is what we're going to do. So then what I was doing is I was doing things not in the order I would normally do them in, which is fine. But then I would try to match my single syllable word to the single syllable work to the multisyllabic work that was happening in school. So with that student, for example, we fast-tracked the R-controlled syllables and left behind some of the other topics that we might normally have gotten to before we hit R-controlled vowels, so that he would have some idea of what was going on in school when his special ed teacher was working on those multisyllabic words with him.
Right. And that's one of my complaints often with IEPs and so forth, with that, at least in Maryland, they have to align with the Common Core standards, which I get, it's understandable. But if you have a 3rd grader that's on Common Core, general education curriculum and so forth, but is reading on a kindergarten level, you can't be teaching 3rd grade skills. Right. You can't align them. That doesn't work, right?
I agree with you completely. Yeah. So when we start up with a new student, first we talk to the parents and, learn about the student and what the parents are seeing and what they're hearing from school and what the student says. And then the next step in our process is to do screeners. So we'll do screeners to test kids in terms of their phonological skills and their phonics skills. And then we take that and we map the results of that to what we call our progress charts. So we have 3 different progress charts. Step 1 is for kindergarten and 1st grade skills. Those are all the phonics and other skills that kids are supposed to have learned in kindergarten and 1st grade. And then we got the step 2 for 2nd grade skills, and then the step 3 for 3rd grade skills. So we'll figure out which skills the student has according to the screeners and which skills they're missing. And we'll go back to the kindergarten and 1st grade progress chart and fill in any holes there are there. Because I agree with you 100%. There's no point in teaching a child 3rd grade phonics skills if they don't know their short and long vowel sounds, which is something they should have learned in kindergarten and 1st grade. So we make sure that children have those kindergarten 1st grade skills, then we move them up to the 2nd grade skills, and then we move them up to the 3rd grade skills, assuming they're already in 3rd grade and beyond. And everybody has their progress chart. So every student and every tutor, every pairing, each person has the progress chart. And as they work through the different topics, everybody gets to cross them off on the progress chart. So the student always sees, okay, these are the topics I need to learn. Those are the ones that are circled based on the screener results. And now I'm putting X's through all the ones that I've learned. So this is what I have left to learn. And that really helps motivate kids. So they don't feel like this is tutoring that's going to go on forever. Who knows when I'm ever going to be done with, it really, I think, helps kids understand where they are in the process, which helps them be motivated to learn to read.
And it's the directed tutoring. So it's not just, somebody is struggling in reading. In the old days before all this dyslexia came out more, I'm dating myself a little bit, back when I was a teacher, it was, like, oh, you just tutor, you just practice reading and practice reading and practice reading. There wasn't the targeted skills of what specific skills needed to be. Right.
Yeah. So that's very different from what we do now, from what the science of reading tells us we should be doing. We really need to find those skills that the student is missing and support those. And interestingly, so a lot of families know about Orton-Gillingham. The Orton-Gillingham method of teaching phonics comes up over and over and over again, and it's great for teaching phonics. From what I've experienced, it's not as strong as I think it should be in terms of teaching kids phonological skills. So the phonological skills are really about understanding truly deeply how our language, how our reading and writing system works. Meaning words are made up of individual sounds. And if you string sounds together in different combinations, you're going to get different words. To somebody who's a fluent reader and a good speller, it's like, yeah, of course, sounds are words and words are sounds. To somebody who's dyslexic, that is not at all obvious. I mean, we work with so many kids who are trying to, when they first come to us, they think they're supposed to be memorizing all these words. They think they're supposed to memorize this word and this word and this word and this word and this word. And they're looking around their classrooms and thinking, Ma, I must be stupid because all of these other kids can memorize these words. I can't memorize all those words. They don't understand. No, you're not supposed to memorize all those words. You're supposed to learn how the system works, that you can sound things out from left to right, and that you can swap sounds out or swap letters out. And you're supposed to learn those letter sound combinations. So, for example, if you see an EA, that's usually going to be E, like eat. But if that doesn't work, try E, like head. And if that doesn't work either, then try A, like great. So unfortunately, we have what's known as a deep orthography. So there are a lot of sound letter combinations. It's not that you can look at this letter and always necessarily know how it's going to be pronounced. That works with most of our consonants, but really not so much with the vowels and not even with all the consonants. There are a lot of phonics patterns that you're going to have to learn, both on the reading side and on the spelling side. Not that those are different things, but they're two sides of the same coin. So, for example, if you're wanting to write a word with the ch sound, there are two possible ways to spell it. You might spell that with the TCH, or you might spell it with the CH. And you need to understand the rules for, well, when do we use the CH and when do we use the TCH? And so we will teach students, okay, if that ch sound in the word is right after a short vowel sound, and this, of course, assumes they know what the short vowel sounds are. You have to teach them that first. But if your ch is right after a short vowel sound, you're going to spell it with the TCH. But if your ch, like hatch or fetch, but if your ch is at the beginning of the word, like chin or chat, you're going to spell it with a CH. If your ch is after a long vowel sound, you're also going to spell it with a CH, like beach or teach. And if your ch is after a consonant, then you're also going to spell it with a CH. Like bench or dolch. So really, they just need to learn one thing. If that sound is right after a short vowel, then you spell it with a TCH. Otherwise, you spell it. Did I say that right? If it's right after a short vowel sound, you spell it with a TCH. Otherwise, you spell it with a CH. So there are all these phonics patterns that we have to learn for reading and spelling.
And I don't think, I'm trying to think back, I don't think those were ever rules taught, or that I was taught to teach those rules. I remember the one thing I remember from I don't know, from teaching, I guess it was when I was getting my master's or even my undergrad, but like when two vowels go walking, the first one does the talking, you know, and then the silent E bops the vowel on the head and says, say your name.
Yep.
but those are like the basic rules that you're taught. The exceptions, you're not necessarily always taught of like, this is when the exceptions are and why.
Right.
Right.
There's a lot of learning about our language that goes into becoming an effective instructor for kids with dyslexia. You really have to know how our language works. Why do we use this spelling? Why do we use that spelling? People often say about English, oh my gosh, it's so complicated. There are no rules. It's completely crazy. It's actually not completely crazy. It's not the nice one-to-one correspondence that you have in some other languages. And yes, it would be a whole lot easier if our system were more like, let's say Spanish or German, but it's not completely crazy either. I mean, I think it's somewhere between 80 and 85% of words are actually spelled the way you think they would be based on the phonics patterns that, kids are supposed to be learning in the early grades. That still leaves another 15+% that are not quite so easy to figure out. But it's not completely crazy, and you can figure out most of it if you learn these rules, like, for example, you use a TCH after a short vowel sound. There are 7 patterns like that, by the way, that you use right after a short vowel sound.
See, look at that. And like, that's the basic things that it's so easy and sounds so easy, but it's not necessarily taught, and you don't need to, right?
That's right.
And I know, like, I think back to like when I was younger and stuff, and dyslexia, everybody's like, oh, that's just when you reverse letters and reverse numbers. And it's not.
Yeah, no, that's not it. That's what people used to think. It doesn't actually have anything to do with reversing letters or reversing numbers. The International Dyslexia Association actually has a definition on their website. I'll paraphrase here, but something along the lines of, it's a neurological disorder. For a lot of kids, it's based in a problem with phonological processing. So those phonological skills that we were talking about before. And then it manifests in all kinds of ways. There's nothing in there about reversing letters, and there shouldn't be anything in there about reversing letters. And there's actually even a movement afoot right now to potentially modify that definition and make it more of a multifactorial explanation of what dyslexia is. So I wouldn't be surprised if that definition were changed in the next year or two. I think the conversations are kind of ramping up to do it. But again, nothing to do with reversing letters or anything like that. I mean, what kids will sometimes do is they'll say, let's say you ask them to write the word saw, and they write was instead. And then you say, no, that's not how we write that word. And they're looking at you like, what do you want? I got 3 letters. I knew it was 3 letters. I knew what the 3 letters were. I just put them down in the wrong order. Who cares? Right. And that's the sign, okay, the student doesn't understand how the system works. They don't have those phonological skills. They don't know that they're supposed to be listening to the sounds and then writing down in order the letters that go with those sounds. So if they're supposed to be writing saw, they're supposed to be thinking aw. Okay, how do we write s with an S? How do we write aw? Well, it's either AU or AW, but at the end of the word, it's definitely going to be an AW. So saw is SAW. So those are some things that parents can be on the lookout for. If their student is writing words that have the right letters but in the wrong order, that's a red flag. That is a definite red flag for there's something going on here. And you might want to look into it a little bit more.
And I do want to say, I want to point out one thing of the so-called screeners they use at school. They don't pick up dyslexia. Like I remember, I mean, so for my daughter at the end of kindergarten, her kindergarten teacher, had me come in and said, look, she's behind, and it's more than that. She's like, I'm not sure what it is. But the screener for dyslexia came out that she's not on the radar for that. Of course, it was the end of the school year, and where I am and knowing what I know, I went and did a private evaluation because I wanted it before the school year started. Okay. And there it is, dyslexia and dysgraphia. Okay. But the school probably wouldn't have picked that up because they don't dig deep enough.
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems is that there's no good, that's not right. I'm trying to figure out how to say this. There's no test. There's no one single test for dyslexia where you can say the student got a 56. And if only they had gotten a 57, they wouldn't be considered dyslexic. But because they got a 56 or below, they are considered dyslexic. It doesn't work like that. So if you take your student to a psychologist for an assessment, they're going to look at lots of different factors. They're going to look at phonological skills. They're going to look at phonics skills. They're going to look at working memory. They're going to look at processing speed. Hopefully, they'll also be looking at RAS speed, and a whole bunch of other things. And then they will make the diagnosis based on all of those factors. That's not something a school can easily replicate. I mean, that's really something that's done by psychologists, and it takes many, many, many hours. Very often, you also have other things going on. There's a fair amount of overlap between kids who've got dyslexia and kids who have ADHD, or kids who've got dyslexia and kids who've got other language issues, whether they're articulation issues or any of the other issues sort of in that language area. There's a lot of overlap between dyslexia and those other things. And I don't know that schools can tease all those things out. I agree with you.
Yeah, and I've seen, because dyslexia falls under specific learning disabilities, and I've seen them say, well, we're the child's making progress in the reading interventions we're doing, so they can't qualify there. And there's no discrepancy, there's no 2 standard deviations, although I think now it's 1.5 standard deviations from, the cognitive and the academic. But what I've found is, because they're just looking at the basic numbers, once you dig deeper and look at the subscores, that's where the dyslexia shows up in those subscores. But schools don't always give the parents the subscores, and parents don't always know to look for it. Why would they? I didn't discover that until, well into my career as an attorney, not even as a teacher. But looking at the subscores, that's because reading as a whole, they're doing phenomenal, because guess what? In comprehension, they're high.
Right.
But things are tested separately. So
Right.
in comprehension, they're high, and then all of a sudden their spelling and phonics are really low. But since comprehension is so high, it pulls and it looks average.
Exactly. And that's the other reason we don't require a diagnosis of dyslexia. We don't even, for many kids, I won't even encourage it if they don't have it, because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether a student officially qualifies as dyslexic or not. We're just going to teach them to read. And I don't care if they're not reading because they're officially, considered dyslexic, or if they have a working memory problem, or if the problem is that they have a slow processing speed, or maybe their intellectual capabilities are not that, of the next, someone sitting next to them. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Your kid can't read. You bring them to us. We teach them to read. And I think I personally, if I were queen for a day, I wonder whether schools shouldn't use some approach like that instead. I understand from a legal point of view, disability law, that's kind of how our system is set up. But if we could start from scratch, wouldn't it be nice if we could just say everybody who needs help with reading gets help with reading, and forget the categories, forget the labels, forget all of the rest of that?
Yeah, which a lot of schools do that. They have reading intervention, reading 180 or whatever interventions they have that pull out for kids that are behind in reading. It's, again, like the laws and the other stuff that's frustrating is they have to fit into one of these boxes to get the IEP, to get the other supports they need, which again is frustrating, because if teachers did a lot of that stuff naturally in the classroom, we wouldn't need so many IEPs. Movement breaks. Guess what? All kindergarten, all elementary school kids, and you know what? Honestly, all kids and adults need a movement break. If every hour it was, the standard practice, every hour I'd get up and walk around the room, or do head, shoulders, knees, and toes, or do some kind of movement break, think of how much better all of our kids would be doing.
Absolutely.
Because, that's where it gets frustrating of the, oh, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. Well, yeah, but I've had teachers say it often in IEP meetings, like, oh yeah, we do that naturally. I always do that. I'm like, that's great. That's fabulous. You need to put it in the IEP. And because the next teacher might not do that naturally and all the time.
Right.
And so if it's something that's being done that isn't usually or always being done, it needs to be on the IEP so that, next person can, knows to do it, knows how to do it, and what the child needs, right?
Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah,
just frustrating. And it's, teachers have enough on their plates. I say it all the time. I don't know how they do it these days. It's hard. It's a lot. I know they probably don't all read the IEPs as much, but my thing is like if at the beginning of the year, the teachers can sit down and look at all the IEPs and just kind of figure out what the basic supplementary aids are and kind of work it into the curriculum, then they don't have to think about it as much. It's happening naturally in their classroom.
That's right. That's right. And what helps one student and what, what the teacher does because of one student may actually inadvertently be helping a whole bunch of other students as well.
Exactly. I remember when I taught kindergarten and I had this one child that could not sit still. He was bouncing all day, but he was probably ADHD, but I can't diagnose or anything. Could not sit still. Well, I started having him change out my bulletin boards. And he was up changing out my bulletin boards. I could stop mid-lesson at any point in time and ask him a question. He could answer it. He just needed that extra thing to do. Yeah. So he's pulling down the papers or stapling up papers, whatever he's doing. It gave him the what he needed to do so that he could pay attention to and not be floating all over the place. So he had that extra.
That's exactly right. So we work with kids over Zoom. And I'm going to say about half of the kids that we work with are ADHD. Have ADHD, and it's fine. It's not a problem. I mean, as you're describing, the bulletin board, I'm thinking of one of the students I worked with who was doing basically laps on her couch. So she would crawl across her couch, go down to the floor, crawl across on the bottom, and then go back up again. And so during our lessons, she would be doing these laps around her couch, and that was what she needed. As long as she was doing her lap, she was paying attention and she was doing what she needed to do. Not for the entire lesson. There were certain points where, going around in circles on the couch wasn't going to work if you're trying to read a story, but it works very well if you're doing phonological exercises, for example, or, and even reading individual words. So we kind of positioned the monitor so that you could read the individual words. So even that was fine. I've got another student I'm working with who's got a mini trampoline. And so during portions of the lesson, he's like a little 5-year-old. He will actually pipe up and say, "Can I go on my trampoline?" Absolutely. And so he goes over and he's jumping on his trampoline while we're doing our lesson, and that's fine. I've got 3 kids, 2 of the 3 ADHD, so kids flying all over the place. It's okay as long as they're actually paying attention to the lesson, and if this is what they need to do in order to pay attention, absolutely go for it.
That makes sense. Yeah. And so, do you only provide services on Zoom, or do you do in person as well?
We only do it on Zoom. We've been doing it this way for years. It was, we developed this program for the pandemic, or during the pandemic, I guess. So it wasn't what a lot of teachers were trying to do, where they were trying to take their, round peg and fit it into a square hole. During the pandemic, we actually created this to be taught over Zoom. And so it's all over Zoom, and it works really well. We've got some great Google reviews out there if people want to go take a look. We've also got some testimonials on our website if people want to look. A lot of people, in that initial conversation, they're like, "What? You do this over Zoom?" I don't know. My student was hiding under the desk during Zoom. I don't think this is going to work. And so, I kind of talk them through it and explain that, no, this actually does work. This is very different from what was going on in the pandemic. And then if they're still really worried, I'm always like, just try it out for a week. Try it out for a week. If at the end of the week, you tell me that, Zoom isn't working for your student, you can walk away. We won't charge you. Not a problem. I've made that offer many, like dozens and dozens of times. Nobody's ever taken me up on it, because once they're actually doing it, they say, "Oh, this really does work." Because in a one-on-one situation, you can engage the student. I can tell if a student has lost attention and is, thinking about something else, or, scribbling something or whatever. I mean, you can tell what's going on with a student, and you can bring that back. That's very different from these poor teachers during the pandemic who had, 25 little boxes on their screen. There's no way anybody can corral 25 boxes on a Zoom screen. That's just not possible. But one-on-one Zoom is very different. And the other thing is, it enables parents and families to do what we call high intensity tutoring, which is lots and lots of tutoring sessions to get your student caught up as quickly as possible. We don't want this tutoring to go on for a year or 2 years or 3 years. And if you Google how long does it take to teach a dyslexic kid to read, you're going to come up with answers from 18 months to 3 years or even more. But you want your student caught up as quickly as possible. So especially in the definitely in the younger grades, because if you can get them through that first grade material, then their second grade teacher can take over and can teach them the second grade phonics patterns, right? So you want them caught up quickly so that their classroom teacher can take over and teach them the rest. And the way you're going to do that is to do many sessions per week. So our students usually do 3 sessions a week or 4 during the school year. And over the summer, it's often 4 or 5. And the only way families can fit that into their schedules is to do it over Zoom. So you're not driving somewhere, you're not waiting somewhere in a center and then driving your student home, because if you're doing that, you can do it once, maybe twice a week. But if you can do the Zoom session, and a 45-minute session actually takes 45 minutes out of your lives, then suddenly you've got the space in your schedule to do it 3 or 4 times, or even 5 times in the summer during the week.
Which makes sense. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So where are you based out of?
That's a good question. That's a good question. So I was a lawyer in DC, as I think I said at the beginning of the podcast. So when I started this all up, I reached out to the families and the schools and the teachers and the psychologists and everybody I know in the DC area. But I actually live in Tucson, Arizona most of the time. Wow. You see that arched doorway over there? I could flip my camera around. I've got an arched window right in front of me. So it's a very Tucson kind of thing to do. And most of our tutors are based in Tucson, Arizona. But we do have some in East Coast time zone as well. It helps us actually with the time zones, because the East Coast, like everybody wants tutoring after school from 4 to 7 p.m. East Coast 4 to 7 p.m. for those of us in Tucson is 1 to 4 p.m. Or when the time shifts, it's 2 to 5 p.m. because Arizona doesn't do daylight savings time. So it's much earlier in the day. I don't really want to be tutoring at 6 o'clock at night, at 7 o'clock at night, but 3 hours earlier in my day, absolutely. And so I think that's one of the reasons there aren't enough. I mean, from what I hear from families, there just aren't enough dyslexia tutors in the DC area. How many tutors really want to be working in those evening hours? So we're able to take advantage of that time difference and have East Coast kids and West Coast kids. We have kids all across the country, but since you're in the DC area, so I figured that's what you were most interested in. So we work with lots. I would say probably about 80% of the kids we work with are somewhere on the East Coast, not necessarily in DC, but somewhere on the East Coast. And then the other 20%.
Yeah, because that's the thing, like, therapies, tutoring, all of that stuff, trying to get that 4 to 7, and get everything fit in. Therapists only have so many times. Tutors only have, so many times. Even if they want to work those hours, there's only so many slots.
That's right. That's right. And so we're able to work with students all across the country and match them up with tutors who have availability when they need it.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That is so awesome. So how can people get in touch with you? Like if they're like, oh, wait a minute, this sounds like the right thing for me. Sounds great that I could find somebody. How should people get in touch with you?
Yeah, the easiest thing is probably to go to our website. So kidsupreadingcoaches.com. I think it's right there on the screen. And there you'll see a couple different buttons. One of them says schedule a meeting. So if you click that button that says schedule a meeting, you'll be right on my calendar and you can schedule a meeting with me. There's another button that says contact us. And you just fill out a super short form. It's like 3 or 4 questions or something. And that also, shows up in my inbox. And then I'll get back to you that way. So reaching out via the website is the easiest. Or you can also just email me directly, Daniela at kidsupreadingcoaches.com. But that's a little more complicated because then you have to spell my name right. And that one's tough. So
right. Which is always challenging, right?
Yeah, exactly. I always tell people it's Daniel, and then you put an A at the end. So just one L, but it's still hard. So the easiest thing to do is probably just to go to the website, www.kidsupreadingcoaches.com, and just find us.
And we'll have all those links in the show notes when it gets published officially. But this has been so awesome. Thank you so much, Daniela, for coming on, sharing your wisdom with the community.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed it. And it was good to see you again, too.
Good to see you, too.
Perfect. Okay.
You've been listening to Stress-Free IEP with your host, Frances Shefter. Remember, you do not need to do it all alone. You can reach Frances through shefterlaw.com, where prior episodes are also posted. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others through YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.